On this, the August 9th, 2023 edition of What the Ship, we look at the top 5 maritime stories. We have updates on previous stories, what's going on in the Panama Canal. We look at the container sector. We examine the situation on the Black Sea between Ukraine and Russia. And then we ask that question, are seafarers happy? I'm your host, Sal Mercogliano. Welcome to this week's show. So, obviously a lot going on. Every week, I keep thinking we're going to slow down in the maritime shipping business, but we don't. And instead, this week has been chocker-blocked, full of information, and we're going to get to all 5 stories here in a second. If you're new to the channel, hey, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, so you'll be alerted about new videos as they come out. All right, let's go ahead and jump into this. All right, some updates to stories we have covered over the past week. Mike Schuller has this over at GCAPTN. Over 3,000 U.S. Navy sailors and Marines arrive in the Mideast amid Iranian threat to shipping. These are mariners and sailors, Marines and sailors on board the Bataan and the Harper's Ferry. Good buddy of mine, Sam Legrone, over at USNI News, asked at the yesterday's Department of Defense briefing about what is the role and mission of these Marines and sailors. What's the agreement they have in place to board foreign ships? And the Department of Defense, in a very long, laborious statement, said no comment. Basically, they have no new information on this. I tend to think that this is all taking place because of the situation with the Suez Rajan, that tanker of the U.S. seas that's sitting off of the port of Houston right now and they can't offload, because no one will touch the Iranian oil. I think this is all being done to placate whoever touches the Suez Rajan oil, that we will provide protection for their tankers. That's my suspicion. I don't have proof on that, but to me, that makes the most logical sense on this. Over in Canada, the ILWU, the International Longshore and Warehouse Union of Canada, voted to accept the port labor agreement. This has been the strike that's been off again. So now they do have an agreement in place, so we should not see any disruptions anymore on the west coast of Canada along British Columbia. However, it will take a while to clear the backlog that just happened regarding containers on that coast. The Coast Guard's issued a report on the progress of clearing the vehicles on board the Grande Costa Avorio. This is the ship that burned in the port of Newark, where 2 Newark firefighters died. The cargo has now been cleared off the vessel. That allows them to get further into the vessel and eventually clear the vessel to be towed away for either scrap or rebuilding. The results of this investigation are going to be crucial to understand what happened that led to the death of those 2 Newark firefighters. The Fremantle Highway was towed into Amshaven. I'm hoping I'm saying that right. I got a lot of people who corrected me on my Dutch pronunciation of Amshaven. Was towed into port, and let me be clear, Fremantle Highway being towed into port is a huge event, because up to this point, vessels that carried EVs largely sank. We did not get them in port. Sincerity Ace, Felicity Ace, I can go on with a list here. But now we're going to get these vessels in, and what's really interesting is that the Smith Bocalis CEO talked about this. He said that the vehicles below 5 deck, and you can kind of see it here on the way the burn is, that the lower vehicles were not very heavily damaged at all. So you're going to be able to salvage some vehicles out of this vessel, but it's on the upper decks, above 5 deck, all the way up to the weather deck, and you can see how it burned through the entire length of the vessel. We talked about this in a video I did, where I talked about the fact that car carriers have these kind of, 2 football pitches long open space decks where they burn, and you can see that right here. It's going to be interesting to determine what was the cause of this fire. No matter what, when you have EVs on board, whether the EV caused the fire or it's an internal combustion engine vehicle that caused the fire, having those EVs on board will accelerate and intensify the amount of fire you have on board because of the chemical nature of the batteries, the power that's charged in them. It is just that more dangerous. And the loss of this vessel does have impact. When Felicity Ace sank in 2022, you still see some major car distributors in the United States running a month behind in their vehicle delivery because it disrupted that flow. I was just on FreightWaves today. I hope to have that video posted the next day or two. Story number 2, what's going on in the Panama Canal? We started as what's going on in the Suez. We've morphed into what's going on with shipping, but now we seem to spend a lot of time talking about the Panama Canal. If you are unaware, the Panama Canal is suffering from low water. The Panama Canal, the locks to the Panama Canal, the 3 on the Atlantic side and the 3 on the Pacific side, are all fed by water from a freshwater lake, Gatun Lake. And as the El Nino is hitting this year, the amount of water in the lake is at all-time low. And that means that they're restricting the draft of vessels going through the canal. Now, the canal has 3 sets of locks. The 2 original sets, which were built back in 1914, and then a new set that was built in 2016. This is the Neo-Panamax lane. This lane, this new set of locks, are larger, longer, wider, and deeper. They allow bigger ships to go through. Under the old locks, the biggest ship, container-wise, that can go through the Suez Canal was about 4,500 TEU. Now, you can go way above that. And when I say way above it, I mean way above it. The max-size ships we've seen going through there are 16,000 TEU. But as Sam notes here in his story, we're seeing issues come in. And what's resulting right now is a logjam at both ends of the canal. Typically, the canal can move anywhere from 36 to 40 ships through at a time. The canal has not just reduced the draft restrictions, but they've reduced the number of vessels going through down to 32 vessels. And that has been a huge reduction in the amount of vessels coming through. Because of the supply chain crisis that happened over the past couple of years, a lot of shippers bringing cargo into the United States are bypassing the west coast of the United States. They're not going into LA, Long Beach, Oakland, Seattle, Tacoma. They're putting their cargo on these big, massive Neo-Panamax container ships going through the Panama Canal and going up to ports in Houston. Houston just opened up a brand new terminal, over to Savannah and New York, New Jersey, and a slew of other ports. However, this is going to slow them up with these draft restrictions. This story over in Lodestar on G Captain talks about this. The largest ship ever to go through the Panama Canal just went through, and that is the Evermax. The Evermax is capable of carrying 17,312 TEUs. The problem is there's a draft restriction in place, which is now set at 44.5 feet from 24 May, and that was reduced a week later down to 44 feet. It's usually at 50 feet. And it's going to go down even further. They're talking about it coming down to 43.5 feet. However, because Evermax came through the canal, it was too large. It had too many containers. It was drawing too much water. And so the issue was to remove some of the containers on board. And what we saw was a reduction. Some of the containers were taken off the vessel and railed across the the Isthmus of Panama, while Evermax sailed through less the number of containers to get it to its draft. And this means added cost to ship that. That additional cost is going to be added to the containers that are on board Evermax. So if you paid a freight rate, there's a clause usually in your contract that says you have to pay for any incidental charges. Well, this is going to be an incidental charge. Getting Evermax across the Panama Canal was an issue, and now you're seeing the surcharges being affixed. Why does this matter? The U.S. built the Panama Canal, opened it in 1914 with a treaty signed with Panama after we've orchestrated a insurrection in Panama to break away from Colombia when Colombia refused to honor the treaty we signed with them because they wanted more money. So we manipulated the Panamanians to declare their independence, and we controlled the canal up until 1979 when it was returned to the Panamanians. It's now operated by the Panama Maritime Authority. This is their annual report for last year, and it shows you the amount of long tonnages that goes through, how much cargo originates in a country and its eventual destination. And you can see very clearly here how important the Panama Canal is to the United States. The U.S. is the largest, by far, user of the canal, whether by origin, cargo going out of the United States through the canal, and this is a lot of grain and oil and other heavy commodities that go through, or by destination. The second country that uses it is Japan, followed by Chile, South Korea, and then a slew of other nations. This is one of the reasons why the Panama Canal being at low water right now is of such critical importance, because if you have to reduce the amount of cargo going through, the amount of ships going through, that's going to have an impact on transportation. That means inflationary costs are going to be added to cargo, and that all comes out of our pockets. All right, let's go ahead and jump to story number 3. All right, story number 3 is the container sector, and let's try to figure out what the frick is going on with the container sector, because I got to tell you, it's all over the place. When you look at different aspects of it and you look at different sectors, man, it is a confusing period. So let's try to break this down piece by piece. So I'm going to jump around here a couple of stories. Start off here with Greg Miller over at FreightWaves. July import volumes continue to mirror pre-COVID normal. So this is the chart from Dakar that always tracks U.S. container import volume. And the key thing to here is to see where 2023, this orange line kind of falls in right now. It is following that 2019, that blue line, pretty good. I mean, if you look at it, we seem to be at that kind of pre-COVID levels. The red line 2020 had that huge spike in the latter half of the second part of the year. That was due to COVID, when everybody shifted their buying patterns and things began to move. Green was that 2021, just that huge boom year that we saw. And then 2022 was mirroring that until all of a sudden it declined. And then it kind of followed the track line for pre-COVID. So we seem to be on a track line here for emulating what happened in terms of container volume pre-COVID, which makes sense because a lot of the added imports we brought in were goods that were not factored in to the previous shipments. Understand, when you hit that button on your phone and all of a sudden you hit Amazon, you say, hey, send me something. That cargo has been moving for months. It's been moving for 6 months almost, and is sitting probably at a distribution warehouse within, a day or two of you. It's not like that thing is being jetted over from China on an airplane for you. They predict through those algorithms exactly how much cargo they need. And what happened in COVID was we changed our buying habits. That's why you ran out of toilet paper. It's not because we were pooping more, although some people did during COVID. It was because we changed where we poop, which means you needed more toilet paper in your home than you did in your office or out at restaurants, because you tend to treat yourself a little better at home and you buy that higher quality toilet paper, because if you can't pamper your ass, what's the sense of having money, right? So we changed our buying patterns, and that impacted the container sector across the board. But now what we're seeing is a lot of mixed messages. So this is one that everyone's been watching. China trade plunges more than forecast in blow to recovery. We know that China is not exporting. The amount of containers coming out of China has decreased. If you follow FreightWaves and a few other organizations, they track this number, and it's a good predictor because this is months ahead of before the containers land in the United States. So it's a good forecaster to tell you, okay, we see this kind of freight recession coming on. However, what we're seeing is also a shift. Not everything is coming out as China in the numbers we've seen previously. And so you have Lorianne Larocco over at FreightWaves with this, what the TEU tea leaves are telling us. This peak season could be less. She goes on here, there's new data out of China, and some people say that they're shocked and surprised the country's manufacturing is hurting. At this point, you want to ask business people who admit this if they are living under a rock. Since June 2022, manufacturing orders have been down 30 to 40%. We are now in peak season, and as all logistics data has shown, it's not going to be stellar. This year's logistics cycle should be called peak season. So as we saw in the Dakar chart, we're at that point where it's kind of capping, and that's what we expect. We're going to see the second half numbers fall. That is not at all surprising. What is surprising is figures like this. Here's Mike Schuller over at G-Captain. U.S. ports brace for highest import volume in almost a year, which is true. The numbers we're seeing right now, while they're mirroring 2019, are going to surpass the numbers we saw for last year, because last year was off a cliff. When we hit July and August last year, the bottom fell out. We are going to be above that. So we'll be above 2023 numbers. So you got to be careful when you start seeing data saying, hey, year to year, we're doing much better than we were last year. Then you see this from Bloomberg, global shipping costs creep higher after 16-month freefall. So this is the confusing part of this story, because I've read all these stories and I've looked at all the data, and it is extremely conflicting right now. So Bloomberg is talking about that shipping costs are creeping higher. And we know that if you look at the Drewry World Index Composite, it's increased 11.8% to $1,761 for a 40-foot container for the fourth straight advance, the biggest week-on-week percentage gain since 2021. The cost from Shanghai to LA reached $23.22 per 40-foot container unit, an 11.3% gain from the previous week and fifth straight increase. The Shanghai to Rotterdam jumped 25% to $16.20, the most since January of 21. So if you look at that, you're looking at this as like, okay, freight rates are going up. We're seeing these freight rates go up. But remember, these are spot rates. These are the rates you book a container if you all of a sudden have a cargo show up and you need to move it. 70% of most containers move on long-term rates that are booked long advance. The spot rate market, it's like getting a last-minute hotel or airline. It's hit and miss. You don't know what you're going to get. Mike Schuller's story, no respite for ocean carriers as long-term freight rates fall to two-year low. Okay, so the spot rates are increasing because we're seeing more cargo all of a sudden have to find spots on ships, but the long-term freight rates are extremely low. And when you go down here, you start seeing that. Zentia shows 9.5% decline in long-term shipping rates since June, adding to the collapse of rates that began last year. So if you see those two stories, you're going to sit there and say, it doesn't make sense. How can rates be going lower and higher at the same time? Low rates because people renegotiated their contracts back in the beginning of the year, usually around March and May, when freight rates weren't looking very good. They got extremely good long-term rates they locked into for the year. But now if you don't have enough capacity in those long-term rates, you've got to get the spot rates. So you've got to book this additional cargo. And as cargo fluctuates and changes, this is where we're seeing that happen. And so this is a reason for the confusion. Then this story over in Lodestar, the transatlantic carriers change course. Really interesting story here. Transatlantic container rates from Northern Europe to U.S. East Coast have fallen below pre-pandemic levels after ocean carriers pumped far too much capacity into the trade lane. And this has to do with the introduction of new container ships into the market. So during COVID, container lines were flush with cash. Container line sailors were drunk with money. They're going to spend it, and they spent it on new ships. This happens in shipping all the time. As soon as companies get money, they buy replacement vessels because when they have cash, they're going to go ahead and do it. And so what you see here is that the transatlantic carriers are putting a lot bigger ships onto the routes, as they talk about down here. Alphaliner said Costco and OOCL, which are basically the same company now, replaced their 8 to 8,500 TEU vessels on the transatlantic with 13,100 TEU ships, just thus injecting additional capacity into the trade. And it's one of the reasons why you saw the spot rates begin to fall on the transatlantic to that level. Go down here, according to Alphaliner, and Alphaliner is one of the best for tracking all this data. That and Linerlytica are really good at tracking container volumes. MSC remains the biggest carrier between Europe and North America with a market share of 37.9%. Man, MSC is just banging it. It's one of the reasons why MSC and Maersk are ending their alliance in 2025. Followed by Hapag-Lloyd at 20%, and Maersk and CMA CGM with 9.6 and 8.4% respectively. So that kind of gives you the concept here of why you're seeing transatlantic rates fall, because there's even more cargo on the transatlantic, but there's more capacity on there. You can actually fit more cargo on those vessels, and the larger ships are much more economical. These new larger container ships that can swing through the Panama Canal or the Suez Canal are much more efficient, both in fuel-wise, fuel economy, and for carriage. They're designed not to sail just fully loaded, so you can load them at different levels. Then you see this warning out of Maersk, and leave it to the Danes to be the most worrisome of the group. Maersk warns of slower demand for container shipping. Can I be clear? Maersk is the sky is falling container liner of all time. They do this for a reason, but it's not because they're paranoid. It's because they are positioning themselves in a way that's going to make the Danes a lot of money. They always do. Maersk never comes out on the short side. And let me be clear, I love Maersk. I love Maersk a lot. I think they're a really dynamic company. Shoot, I got a Maersk container ship up here. I like Maersk a lot. But the container sector is, the Danes know the container sector, and they're playing it extremely, extremely well. And the other group who's coming out on top on this are the container lessors. These are the companies that lease the containers. So way back prior to 2008, if you looked at the container market and you see all those names on containers all the time, that's because the container ships own their containers largely. And so you had this system where the container ships and the containers were all, simpatico, they were all together. Well, in 2008, when the global economic crisis hit, container companies had to generate cash because trade went down. And so one of the things they sold off were containers. And you saw the creation of these container lessor companies. And these companies right now are making a huge amount of money. Container leasing companies reported a slowdown in return of boxes by ocean carrier customers in the second quarter and say that they are optimistic of a recovery in demand for equipment in the second half. Further, the lessors stand to benefit from the 1.2 million TEUs of new build tonnage stemmed for delivery before the end of the year, necessitating super slow steaming, longer turnarounds for containers, and a consequential requirement for upgrades in the container equipment fleet. Collectively, ocean carriers lease around 50% of the 54 million containers they use on trade lanes. That's why so many containers now don't have company names on them, because you're just getting them from these lesser companies. And so companies like Triton and Textron these are the companies that are really going to be benefiting right now in this market, doing extremely well, and expect them to do extremely well going forward. All right, let's go ahead and jump over to our next story. So story number 4 is this week's Patreon story. I have a batch of new patrons over on my Patreon page. If you want to help support the page, it's one of the best ways to do it, because you can do a one-time membership, you could do a monthly membership, you could do a year-long, and become members. This story is for you because it was asked by several members on that group who wanted to see it. So let's talk about what's going on. After attacking Ukraine wheat exports, Russia faces its own shipping problems. The Black Sea is escalating. John Conrad and I, way back in February last year when the war started, did a series of videos on this. We talked about this. And we talked about the fact that the Black Sea could escalate into the Persian Gulf of the 1980s when you had the tanker war. We are beginning to see that. And if you just look at the progression this past week at the stories, you'll see that. So this is back in August 1st. Russia says it thwarted a Ukrainian attack on Navy and civilian ships in the Black Sea. The Ukrainians are using those unmanned surface vessels, those kind of kamikaze kayaks they have, that have a Sea-Doo engine on the back, and they can control them via satellite. And they have a infrared visual on it, and basically they just joystick this into the side of a vessel. And you can carry a pretty substantial warhead. They say up to 450 kilograms, but I think that depends on how much fuel they have on board. Because of the size of those vessels, the engine plant takes a fixed space, and then the two other variables you have are either fuel for range and payload for the warhead. And you can probably trade off there to get more range. Go on here. Russia strikes the Ukraine Danube port, sending global grain prices higher. After Russia withdrew from the Black Sea Grain Initiative, and you are no longer hauling grain out of the 3 ports around Odessa, the only place Ukraine is exporting grain by ship is out of the Danube River, the ports of Remy and Izmail. Very small ports. You can't bring big bulk ships into those ports. You're talking about ships of around 10,000 tons, vice 50 to 70,000 that can go into the ports around Odessa. Well, the Russians struck those ports. Going on here, Romania is working to clear those logjams. There's a huge logjam of vessels off the Danube River anchorage. We've seen that grow since the Ukrainians took back Snake Island, and the Danube River really became their only place to export large quantities of grain. Yes, you can haul it overland by truck and rail, but nowhere near the tonnage necessary. By boat is the way it goes. And even if you get your grain into Romania, Hungary, or Poland, that's not where it needs to go. It needs to be shipped somewhere else. So just getting it out of Ukraine isn't the solution. You got to get it on boats, because it's going to Spain, it's going to Turkey, it's going to India, it's going to China, it's going to Africa. You need to be able to get it on boats. But then the Ukrainians stepped it up, and you saw those attacks on Russian warships. This is the drone attack on a Russian landing ship tank off the port of Novorossiysk. And that severely damaged the vessel. You saw a massive list to port on that vessel. But again, you're hitting these ships at the waterline. It's not an underwater hit, which is even more catastrophic. And I think even with the size of warhead on here, it's not enough to sink some of these vessels. So you saw the LST get hit. The Ukrainian attack on the port of Novorossiysk has caused disruptions of oil and grain. We're seeing right now, there's a story over in Lloyd's List showing that tankers and other ships waiting to get into Novorossiysk are sitting off the port right now, waiting to come in until the berth is available because they don't want to take the chance of getting hit by these Ukrainian USVs. Then you saw the Ukrainians hit a tanker off the coast of the Kerch Straits. This is a tanker that the Russian government uses. It's a civilian tanker, but it's one of two vessels the Russian government uses to haul oil, or fuel, I should say, from Russia down to Syria. And it's believed to be aviation fuel. So you need really clean tanks for that. You need really specific vessels to do this, dedicated vessels. And hitting the SIG, as they did here, damaged the vessel. Now, the tanker was empty. It's very hard to sink an empty tanker. You punch a hole in the side of a tanker and water goes into it, but it's designed to carry liquid, so it's very hard to do. They hit it around the engine room, which is where you want to hit a tanker if you're going to sink it, but since it was empty, it was extremely buoyant. Also, it wasn't enough to cause enough structural damage to sink this vessel, but it is an escalation because both the Ukrainians and the Russians are now saying they're going to target vessels going into each other's ports, whether they're military or commercial vessels. Right now, the Ukrainians have just hit Russian-owned and Russian-flagged vessels. The question becomes, will the Russians hit not just Ukrainian-flagged vessels, but those flags of other registry heading into the Danube to load grain? And then you see this, Navy drone strikes will likely slow Russian oil and grain exports. And I think this is true. We're seeing that slow down. It's increasing the amount of insurance needed by vessels to go into this area, even though Ukraine is underwriting war risk insurance, and the Russians will probably do the same. A lot of companies are going to sit there and say, this is not for us. And so we kind of roll full circle here that we are seeing an escalation on the Black Sea. And this has impact on global food prices, on the amount of food that's available to ship out. Now, we're not seeing food shortages right now because we've had a surge of food being available from other places. But India just announced a hold on exporting of rice, and all you need is a drought or an environmental issue, and all of a sudden that Ukrainian and Russian grain not hitting the market is going to cause a problem. The Black Sea is a big problem, and we need to be spending more attention to it. And I can't help but note that the U.S. is sending military forces to escort commercial vessels, not U.S. flag commercial vessels, but foreign flag commercial vessels in and out of the Straits of Hormuz because of these Iranian very infrequent attacks. But whereas in the Black Sea, we're not seeing that same level of protection. The NATO and the European Union and other countries are not providing protection for vessels transiting through international waters in the Black Sea. One of the reasons why you're seeing ships skirt along Bulgaria and Romania and the Turkish coast is to be in territorial waters of nations that could potentially protect them. All right, let's jump to our last story. Our last story is one I always choose, and when it comes to seafarers, I'm going to choose this story every time I see it. Mike Schuller over at G-Captain, Seas of Discontent. Seafarer happiness continues to decline. Yes, seafarers are not happy. Why? Because it sucks. It literally sucks to be at sea at time. I know it sounds romantic and it sounds great, but the working conditions, principally not for U.S. flag or Western nations and first world mariners, but for mariners from around the world, from the Philippines, from India, from Russia and Ukraine, from China and Indonesia, is pretty bad. So the last survey conducted in association with North Standard and Idlewild, supported by Inmarsat, showed a decrease in overall happiness from 7.1 out of 10 to 6.77 out of 10. This is a big decrease. Obviously, this is measures a lot of factors in here. And when you see it, you can begin to understand. They list several of the issues here. Obviously, COVID was one of the biggest issues. You couldn't get off the vessels. Crew changes were delayed. You couldn't get to your vessel, which means you weren't getting paid. And so all of that created a lot of problems. But this one right here, shortage of available drinking water is a major concern for seafarer happiness, as it was a common problem despite being covered by the Maritime Labor Convention. Rising global food prices have also negatively impacted seafarers, with low company meal budgets and expense cuts leading to insufficient food supplies for periods up to 2 to 3 weeks. You don't have enough food and water on a ship? I mean, where are we living? Is this the 19th, 18th century? What's going on here? How is that not raised as soon as a ship pulls into port and those port state control inspectors come on board and you sit there and say, hey, I haven't been able to shower because we don't have enough fresh water. I don't have enough water to clean myself. I don't have enough decent food to eat. This is a huge problem. And again, we benefit from this off the back of 1.8 million mariners around the world. Seafarers are also facing limited opportunities for shore leave. The idea that your ship pulls in, the gangway goes down, and you go down the gangway and you have a great old time in the port doesn't happen. It doesn't. First off, you're restricted to ship lots of times. And even if you're not restricted to ship, you're restricted to the port. So, for example, if you come into the United States, you need a visa to go ashore. If you don't have that visa approved, you're not going ashore. It means if you pull in LA and Long Beach, you're not going down to go see Grauman's Chinese Theater. You're not going on a TMZ tour. You're not doing that stuff. Maybe if you're lucky, the port has a Seafarers Institute rec hall you can go to. You can go get a drink if you want to drink, go watch some TV, go be with some other people. Maybe there's a store on the port. You can buy some stuff. But largely, it's not. And you go down here and you begin to see why. This is a quote from Reverend Canon Andrew Wright, the Secretary General of the Mission to Seafarers. Quote, "It is extremely disappointing to read of contracts being altered or disregarded, leading to payment issues, salary cuts, rising taxes, and increased living costs, as well as such fundamental requirements such as good quality meals, access to shore leave, and manageable workloads. All seafarers are fully entitled, to expect fair compensation for their hard work, dedication, and commitment to keeping international shipping moving. It is incumbent upon all of us to address these issues and make the improvements required to enhance seafarers' working conditions, well-being, and job satisfaction." If you ever wonder why there are unions in maritime shipping in the United States, this is the friggin' reason right here. Because to this day, the last time I sailed and I signed an international voyage agreement, it specified how much food I had to get. Not, literally ounces of meat, it would say on there. Because ship owners will screw you. They will do everything possible. And understand, the one thing on board ship that you have that's a diversion from your everyday is going down to eat 3 times a day, having decent meals, and if you're lucky enough to have Inmarsat on board, satellite phones, so that you can get, TV, movies, communication, you can email, you can text, you can maybe even call somebody. But a lot of ships don't have that. Why'd the Wakashio go ashore? Well, because they were trying to get close so they can get some shore-based shore-based cell phone reception. This is a huge problem. We treat mariners like crap worldwide. And a lot of people want to advocate, hey, we need to use these foreign mariners in and around the United States. Understand, we will treat them like crap too, because it is those shipping companies that do it. They do not treat them nice. And these are people who are bringing the goods every day. Over 12 billion tons of goods are moving around the planet on ships. Fishing, offshore drilling, ferries, you name it. There's a world of stuff that's being done by mariners. And largely they get treated pretty badly. The minimum wage for international seafarers is about $22 a day. A day. That's the minimum wage. But sometimes a part of that wage goes to pay for food and other incidentals that are being charged by these companies. We're seeing this now with the returns of crimps. People who get mariners on the vessels, they take a portion of the salary. These are things that we outlawed in the United States that unions did to fix this. And I'm not a big advocate for unions. Let me be clear. We have a problem with maritime unions in the United States. We have freaking too many of them. And they compete against each other. Stupidest freaking thing in the world. Why do maritime unions in the U.S. compete against each other for the few jobs? They should pool their resources together and get one unified union for seafarers. Because if you own a ship in the United States, you got to deal with multiple seafarer unions, and no one would want that. There's a better way to do this, and being aware of this issue is the key. If you're new to the channel, hey, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell so you'll be alerted about new videos as they come out. Leave a comment, share it across social media, and if you can, give it a thumbs up. How do you support the page? You can do it one of two ways. Super thanks. Hit that super thanks button down below, and you can contribute directly to the page. I've got a lot of great people who contribute to the page. Mike Mayo, Tim B at C. I appreciate it. A lot of you are contributing to the page, and I can't thank you enough. This is what allows me to do this. I don't have to go work another job. I don't have to be an adjunct professor. I can focus on this and put out a good product. It takes a lot to do this, equipment, subscriptions, and so I appreciate everything you do to help support the page. But if you can, hit that super thanks button down below or head on over to Patreon and become a patron of the page. You can become a one-time, a monthly, or yearly subscriber. Until our next video, sorry about the length of this one. It's a little bit longer, but there's a lot going on. Until our next video, this is Sal signing off.